Hi there, welcome to this recording of our Writing Hub event, Spelling, Punctuation, and Grammar, Foundational or Decorative. This panel discussion originally took place on the 19th of January, 2022. My name is Claire Bennett, and I am a learning developer with the Center for Academic Development, as well as being the coordinator of the Writing Hub. So in this session, panel members and participants discussed the Office for Students report, assessment practices in English higher education providers, spelling, punctuation, and grammar. We really hope that you enjoy watching.
Thank you, Claire. Great to see everybody. So yes, my name is Roger Dalrymple, a program lead in the School of Education, where one of the areas I look after is the BA Hons English Language and Linguistics, and that reflects my own background in English before I became an educationalist. I've also had the pleasure of doing a couple of secondments across Brookes university-wide, and they've been related very much to inclusive practice development and also to access and participation initiatives. So it's with those two hats in mind that hopefully I can bring something to the discussion today.
Thanks, Roger. Adrian.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adrian Wallbank. I'm a part-time lecturer in educational development in OCSLD. I'm very new to Brookes, like you, Claire. I think I started in October, and I will be going full-time, actually, at Brookes at the end of March. But for now, my other role is actually as a senior teaching fellow in the Centre for the Development of Academic Skills at Royal Holloway, where I have been Programme Director for their integrated foundation years. And I've been involved in academic writing programmes and academic literacies programmes, student-facing, since 2008. So I've read many hundreds of student essays from every discipline that you can possibly think of. So I'm kind of coming at this from that angle. But I also research and write on neurodiversity, particularly dyslexia, academic writing and inclusion. So nice to meet you, everyone.
My name is Dr. Andrea McRae. I'm a principal lecturer for student experience in the School of English and Modern Languages, although the principal lecturer role is kind of faculty level. And some of the things I work on a bit as principal lecturer are things like inclusive assessment, which is very much speaks to the nature of this report.
And Martha.
Hi, my name's Martha O'Curry, and I work in the Centre for Academic Development, and I look after our in-sessional academic English provision, which is the development of academic English skills for the international students, but also our open access workshops and our embedded discipline-specific academic literacies work. So the broad theme there and what links to today is 98% probably of what we do is writing development in some kind. And so, yes, I have an interest in terms of the student perspective. Like Adrian, I've worked with a lot of students on their writing development, but also trying to, from an inclusivity perspective, I'm interested in this and what it means for students who come from a non-English speaking background particularly. And so I'm really glad we're discussing it, because I think the paper, the report opens up a really important conversation. I don't think it's anywhere near a solution that it proposes, but I think it's a really good starting of a much longer conversation. And I'm really interested to hear what everybody, including everybody who's come. It's good to see lots of other colleagues here who are interested in discussing it.
In order to get everybody kind of, thinking about this, and I'm sure you've thought about this, so much, but I thought it would just be interesting for us all, before we kind of dive into it and hear from the panel members, to have a think and kind of share our thoughts on what we think of as good writing. So if you could, I'm going to share my screen with you and ask you to go use Menti and add 3 qualities of good writing. criticality and evaluation, logic, sequence, flow, clear structure that the reader can follow, space for individual style to come across. Yeah, and that's really interesting, including norms that may not be, within the defined standard. So, if we're working to these conventions, is there a chance that we could lose our own voice because we're, trying to stick to these guidelines and these rules? Great. So I'm going to let that keep scrolling for a moment. I don't want anybody to feel that, we've got a pretty big audience. I don't want anybody to feel that their ideas haven't been shared. So we can revisit that. But it looks like, the word I'm seeing a lot is clear, well-structured, clear, and a lot of criticality as well. So yeah, great. So I'm going to stop sharing for now. And thank you for those responses. It's kind of getting us all sort of moving and thinking about what we really value as good writing. And that's the first question that I'm going to kind of throw out to the panel members. So it's kind of a twofold question. The first part of it is, what does it tell us about what we in the academic community value as good writing? And do you think this, the report and the way they've kind of gathered this information and discussed this captures really what good writing is?
Without jumping straight to the difficult stuff, I don't think that writing told us all I think the report told us is that it doesn't reflect what's actually happening in the academic community. So it seemed to me like a report that was quite in isolation, that hadn't really consulted on the voices of what other people think good and effective writing is. I would say that because it was so reductive, and also that it didn't acknowledge its own bias or the complexities of what is English with a capital E. So I would say that was problematic about the report. So it didn't tell me anything about what good writing is. It told me that we have a problem with seeing our own lens, I suppose, in how we view what acceptable language is. I'm just going to throw this word out, which is the when I was reading a little bit about this, I was reading, and the word ratio-linguistic ideology came up, which I thought kind of, or the what, the white listener. The report to me was very much written in the voice of the white listener. So, and we can't really address the report unless we address that. I think. I don't know. Sorry to jump straight in with the difficult, but you have to.
Go ahead. Yeah, you do.
Otherwise, we're just ignoring the elephant in the room. I think. I don't know what anybody else thinks.
I'd agree that the report perhaps has this emphasis on rather surface features of writing. If you look at what colleagues have just emphasized there, aspects like clarity and aspects like flow are about something deeper than purely the features of punctuation and spelling. I thought also perhaps, does the report assume a rather kind of unitary notion of what academic prose is? I think part of the delight of writing academically is extending your register and developing a range of registers and a sense of a linguistic repertoire. And some of the most interesting work I'm aware of around academic writing is playing deliberately with registers and modes and discourses. So the patchwork text model of assessment is something I have some experience of, where the academic task is actually precisely about sometimes writing more creatively and throwing grammar and punctuation to the winds and following much more a model of individual expression, then having a task that is perhaps more traditionally framed in academic terms and other modes of writing. So I just wonder if the report is assuming a more unitary model of what academic prose is, and I think then that raises this question of who has vested interests in that model and who is listening to somebody who writes authoritatively or with gravitas in that kind of mode. So I would echo those points from Martha. I think those are important to to have in mind. In terms of, you know, is there a model of academic prose that is a norm anymore? I think that's really worth exploring. I think also there is something participative in here. So I would feel, from a kind of access and participation perspective, that actually gaining access to a different register or a different way of writing is one of the added values that we offer to students in coming into a university context, so that they are able to frame things in a way that they would not have been able to frame them once at point of entry. And so the idea of one of the things we're teaching people is the capacity to make multiple manifestations of the same idea in different registers, and that is giving them a whole breadth of life skills and communicative competence. I think that is an important thing. And again, perhaps the report is a little more focused on the surface details rather than on the added value of those things.
I'd agree with everything that Martha and Roger have said. I think there's a drift here as well between what is enshrined in the QAA kind of quality code, if you like, in terms of what is appreciated or indeed in a graduate attribute that some institutions have got, in terms of being able to communicate complex ideas to multiple audiences and things like that. And I wouldn't say that they are kind of surface features, to use Roger's phrase, but the report, it seems to be focusing in on surface features to me, and neglecting those kind of deeper meaning-making kind of levels of rhetoric and academic writing, but at the same time almost kind of leaves that in there, I think, as I think when in the case studies, it does seem as if some institutions have stripped out not just the kind of surface level stuff, but also that broader communicative kind of element of learning and indeed communicating ideas. So I think there's been a drift possibly within the report, but also I wonder whether there is a little bit of a drift in terms of what is actually going on in institutions and what the QAA kind of guidance is on this, in the sense that if we look purely at the report, and obviously the report's full of problems, we know that, the impression that it gives, I think, is that institutions perceive writing increasingly merely as a vehicle for displaying learning outcomes, and that writing itself is not actually one of those learning outcomes unless it's in an exceptional circumstance. But of course, in the QAA guidance, you know, it's very clear actually that communicating effectively and reasoning soundly, and being able to evaluate evidence in different forms of writing and different forms of audience, that's there. And I think there's been a bit of a drift in terms of what institutions are actually measuring. There's been a drift away from the QAA, but also within the report, there's a little bit of a drift as well. To put it more brutally, I think in terms of what the OFS report thinks we value, I get the impression that the OFS report thinks that we don't really value writing, certainly not at kind of a surface level. I'm not saying that's not what we actually do value, but that's the kind of impression that the report is giving. The one thing I do fundamentally agree with, I know I'm rabbiting on a little bit here, I'll shut up in a second, is the question of employability here. I just think whilst we all appreciate the kind of deeper levels of communication within writing and all the rest of it, the surface level stuff, the basics, is fundamental, and I think is fundamental to employability. And I was thinking about this, I mean, supposing you had a plumber come in and fit a new bathroom in your home, and the wash basin and the toilet, they work effectively, they do the job that they were designed to do. They take away the waste, they fill it with water and all the rest of it, but they're full of leaks. They leak everywhere. I think you'd be quite annoyed at that. And I think it's the same with the writing. So you can have a student possibly expressing themselves accurately, possibly even evaluating evidence in a manner which meets the learning outcomes. But if there are many, many mistakes surface level mistakes, yeah, I'm not quite sure that's right, and I do think we're doing a disservice to students by not picking up that, because as the report actually highlights, the employability element of this is really, really important. And I'll come back to that later if I may. Actually,
I do largely agree with some of the things that have been said so far. And we're amongst friends. I almost didn't accept the invitation to speak at this panel because I'm so incensed by this report. I find the focus on punctuation, spelling and grammar to be unusual, given that you could focus on so many other things in terms of what our graduates come out the other end of a degree with, in terms of critical thinking and reasoning skills and using evidence and being able to form a cogent, rigorously grounded argument. Now, I confess I'm one of those people that would happily go around with a black marker and correct posters that have got an apostrophe missing. I do care about punctuation and grammar, and I do think it's important. In order for people to be able to communicate clearly, both in life and in employment contexts. And I think realistically, one of the most significant interventions we could make with our students with regard to their graduate prospects would be to do more around the teaching of written English expression, because it is still one of the very quick and easy criteria that employers use to sift out applications. But nonetheless, it isn't inherently one of the programme learning outcomes in a lot of degrees, and therefore we shouldn't be assessing it. If we're not saying we're assessing it, we shouldn't be assessing it. And I know that a lot of programmes don't regard technical written expression in English as inherent to their subject discipline. We do in my subject, and it's in our marking criteria, and we very carefully assess it. But having said that, we don't teach it. And this whole report is about assessment of this rather than teaching of it. Why is the emphasis not on how are we teaching this at higher education? How are we proactively helping students improve their skills in this within higher education? But frankly, more to the point, how are we doing that at key stages 1 through 5 at school? Because I think at universities, we still operate on an assumption that students will arrive with a fairly good standard of written English. And so our main method of helping students augment those skills is through assessment feedback, through annotation on written work, which is not an effective way of teaching written English. We don't have room in those comments to say anything other than this is wrong, this is right. We don't get the space to explain why. What are those complex grammatical rules that dictate that that is wrong in that context, but actually might be right in that other context over there? We don't create space for that within our programs. And I would gladly do more of that, but it is also an incredibly hard thing to teach. I've got a qualification for teaching English as an additional language. I know how hard some of these very complex rules within English are to convey. And those students who are better at it tend to be the kinds of students who've come from backgrounds with lots of books around, with smaller class sizes at school, with more one-to-one attention. So the focus on this particular aspect of performance and focusing on it within assessment, it does seem slightly wrong-headed to me, not very well thought through. And that argument about the correlation with inflated grades, with no evidence to support that whatsoever, even correlation, never mind causation, is exactly the kind of, I want my students to come out with better critical thinking skills than that, and with more skills and the ability to create a well-evidenced argument. And those, even as an English scholar, those are my priorities. So yes, I've got strong feelings about this. So don't tweet me. I can't handle Twitter for a week naught. But yeah, that's broadly where I sit in relation to this report.
We've talked a lot about the students and what they're bringing and what we're expecting. So, is this report kind of causing us to reflect on our expectations of in terms of the proficiency for the students that are starting on these courses? And then if that's the case, as Andrea said, how do we address these issues? Written feedback and an assessment might not be enough. And, is there time or scope to do that? I'm not sure if anybody wants to talk to that issue.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say that just to respond to what Andrea was saying about I think they meant the only time in the report that the report mentioned teaching was about the implications of their recommendations. You know, you're talking this whole report about education, and you say, oh, this might have some implications on teaching in a one-liner, and that was kind of, yeah, and exactly as Andrew was saying, is who would do it. You know, I feel, having taught English for 20 years, that I'm still learning it all the time, and I'm still challenged by it, and I still have questions that are tricky to answer for students, and I'm not sure why, and I'll think about it. But that's not in everyone's comfort zone, and nor should it be if you're learning to be, you know, something else. So who would deliver it, even at the most basic level? Is that's my consideration, yeah, as well as how much time have you got for it, because it does take time. And one of our academic English modules where we teach the basics of essay writing is 36 hours of input, you know, 36 hours of classroom time. We would expect for them to come out with the ability to write an essay, you know, 2 different types of essay, for example.
Catherine has a hand raised, and I know I said we were going to kind of start to discuss, but you know, we can open it up. Kevin, have you unmuted Catherine there? Yes.
So I just wanted to sort of ask about my main concern, which is I'm a study skills tutor for students with dyslexia and related conditions. Obviously, using all the best spelling and grammar and punctuation checking software out there is one of the things I spend a lot of time teaching students to do. But I've found even if you get students, you know, you teach students to run all their assignments through 3 different spell checking softwares and, you know, use them using common sense, because sometimes these spell checking softwares make mistakes. Even then, there are errors that will be missed. Obviously it would be an unfair advantage for me to proofread their work for them, so I can't do that. All I can do is teach them how to do it themselves. So my concern is really, you know, in this role, what do I do if, you know, if things change and students come to me and say, you know, I was marked down for spelling, grammar, or punctuation, I'm being discriminated against because of my dyslexia. Where do I go with this? You know, I don't feel it's my role to advocate for them. I feel it would be a conflict of interest. So probably I'd just send them to the students' union, to the students' reps, but it's sort of a nerve-wracking thing. You know, what happens when those kind of questions are asked, and how do we answer them?
Well, they're the point Andrea made earlier about whether the assessment rubric for that particular module that particular student is bringing for discussion, I think is so key. You know, is this something actively assessed and specified in the criteria, or is it actually a more generalist comment that somebody has made in their feedback? But actually, if they're asked to triangulate it against, you know, which domain of the assessment rubric is this being held against, if it's not patently there, I think that student is right to actually have a discussion with their module leader at that point.
Because my anxiety is maybe that was going to change. So maybe following this kind of a report, you know, it wouldn't just be trainee teachers who attest on their ability to teach spelling to students. It would be, you know, more people across more courses. It would be seen as a core component. And in that situation, you know, where someone is going from first year into second year, and in first year, a lot of allowances were made. Now they're going into second year, more is expected of them, but at the same time, you know, the standards have changed from one year to the other. We may well get some complaints, and it may well be difficult to deal with. So if you know, because it's easy to give people extra allowances, but to sort of take them away, it then, you know, is potentially quite difficult to deal with people's reaction to.
I don't think practices can change in that regard legally, because I think it would be discrimination. I think the argument made in this report that you can teach students with dyslexia to reach a competence standard speaks to a fundamental misunderstanding, and dare I say even like stark ignorance about the nature of dyslexia. And the reasons that those 3 tools that students might use to check their work still throw up errors is precisely because the nature of English is so complicated that Grammarly is wrong in places. Grammarly will misadvise students, and the owners of that company know that. They know that their system isn't flawless because the rules are so complicated. It really speaks to how difficult grasping English is in a learned fashion. It's a lot easier for students who can absorb information and read a lot and just kind of absorb it rather than being taught explicitly. But when you're explicitly teaching it, it's really difficult. And I've noticed some comments in the chat about how students might feel about comments on their assessments focused on that surface level stuff. One of the practices we've tried to introduce in our program is actually to try and steer staff away from doing that too much, because it's a very easy thing to comment on. Actually, if you've got a lot of marking to do, it's a very kind of in your face thing that you can give feedback on. But if you do it a lot, it gives the student the impression that actually that's dominating what their marking is, what their mark is being determined by, whereas in our marking criteria, expression is only about 5% of our marking criteria. There was another comment about how dyslexic students sometimes actually seem to perform quite well with regards to written expression. I would say, yes, that's true too, but that masks the incredible amount of effort they have to put in order to do that, the disproportionate amount of time they spend wrangling with written expression in order to try to perform in line with their peers, in fear of that discrimination, in fear that their critical thinking can't be perceived because of those problems with written expression. And it's precisely that which a wider variety of assessment formats can get around, and which is why I'm kind of constantly banging the drum for verbal kinds of assessments. I've got students who can very easily and very confidently communicate very complex ideas verbally, whereas they are absolutely tied up in knots in writing because of dyslexia or an associated learning disability or learning difficulty. So there are, I think it won't come to the situation that Catherine, that you fear, because I think that would constitute discrimination in very real terms, and I think there would be an awful lot of backlash in the way of it getting to that level.
I really despise Grammarly, but it's incredibly widely used, and I don't think we could stop students from using it. But I think the trouble with putting a lot of emphasis on precise grammatical accuracy and punctuation is that it won't actually improve their ability. They will just become better users of Grammarly or better users of online tools to correct grammar. So I think there's, I think there could be a problem in putting too much emphasis, because the way that students will go at this is look at how can I fix this? Maybe that you don't think that's a problem. I'm sure there's a variety of views among us about the appropriacy of students using Grammarly. But I think I'm really concerned personally about the overuse of online tools in student assignments. That's me thinking with my academic integrity hat on, but also just, what are students really prioritizing? And I think we do better to prioritize or get them to prioritize what they're learning about, their understanding of subjects, not a fixation with grammatical accuracy.
We were talking about the ability to convey meaning and discuss complex ideas. And as you were just saying, to be able to do that in conversation is, you don't necessarily need to adhere to specific conventions to get your meaning across. Do we think, or is it possible to convey meaning and discuss these complex ideas in writing without adhering to these conventions? And another question is, does our understanding of what good writing is and how it's assessed change for different disciplines?
I'd say, Claire, that I do think that it is perfectly possible to convey the complexity of the arguments and ideas within the various disciplines in a way that fully meets the learning outcomes and can do justice to the students' ideas, even if it's kind of riddled with, you know, the surface areas that we're kind of talking about. I do think that's possible. But again, I'm not convinced that necessarily we're setting students up for, dare I say it, the real world. I don't know if this particular participant is here, but there was a participant the other day on one of our Explore sessions who came from world of journalism, and they were kind of half in academia and half in the world of journalism, and they'd actually worked with Piers Morgan, and they were saying that, you know, the kind of the level of feedback or the level of communication skills with the polish of the surface areas, things that we're talking about in the workplace is kind of just, you know, not really tolerated. It's got to be there. And I do wonder whether, to a certain extent, if we kind of measure student success, you know, based on the ability of them to express their ideas, even if they come out in an incoherent way, whether we're fully preparing them for that kind of the world of work. That's just my worry, really.
Hi, so we had a great panel discussion and we had many interesting points made by our participants afterwards. And I've got my colleague Martha here with me today to kind of sum up some of the key points that were made in that discussion. We had one lecturer who discussed 2 levels of error that he was seeing in the writing of his students. On one level, which was addressed by the Office for Students report, he saw errors with spelling, punctuation, and grammar that were notable and problematic, but they didn't obscure meaning. But on another level, he found that there were errors with language that obscured meaning. And from his experience, a lot of these were native English speakers who had difficulty communicating their ideas in academic writing. And he found that the consequence of this was that when he was marking their work, he wasn't able to assess whether learning had occurred because the students couldn't express it in an academic format, an academic writing context. So what can we do to support these students and those teaching them?
I think when you ink a student, it's not to do with errors of spelling or grammar. It's more around the communication of ideas. Really, the main way that can be developed is through talking about the student text. So it's got to be opportunities for lecturers and the student to talk around the text and what the student is wanting to say, and then working one-to-one with the student on how they might develop their writing and develop their use of cohesive devices or develop their style or whatever it is in order to make their ideas clearer to the reader. And I think that kind of development has to happen in response to student produced text. So you can't teach that in a lecture or a seminar. That has to be through formative assessments and feedback on those formative assessments.
In terms of the support for students and module leaders, what can the Centre for Academic Development offer them?
So I think we can help in 2 ways. Obviously, we can help a lot through the one-to-ones, and that's the value of our one-to-one offering, is that students are getting feedback on text that they've already produced. And another way we can help is particularly around helping students make sense of feedback. So often lecturers can be pressed for time, or that there might be some kind of disconnect between what the lecturers want to say in the feedback and the message that the students are taking away from the feedback. And I think that what we're particularly good at, because we see so much feedback, is helping to sort of bridge that disconnect and maybe helping students to unpick what a lecturer might mean when they say they need more this, or they need more analysis, or they need, and we can help work with the students to sort of build learning around that. And that's definitely one of the key ways. And we do that both through one-to-ones, but also maybe through sort of group work that we do when we deliver embedded academic literacies work in the modules. And also, you know, ideally, offering students feedback, you know, at modular levels. So building us into the formative assessment process. That's definitely something we're trying to build into our departmental languages, literacies and skills provision, is working with academic staff who maybe don't feel comfortable in terms of the structure of language or writing development from a sort of linguistic perspective, and maybe just work building in feedback from us as part of the assessment process. So kind of aggregated marking, really, with us providing some of it.
Yeah. Okay, and then moving on. So that was one question that this particular participant had. He also went on to say he was worried or concerned that this type of discourse was not being taught at school. So students were coming into university deficient in these skills. And one of our panel members, Adrian, responded to that by discussing how his nieces, who are 13 and 14, were being taught skills like grammar at school. So he had hope that we will see, as these students progress through their studies when they get to university, that these skills might be present in their writing. Andrea wasn't as confident, and she was of the belief that these skills, although addressed in Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4, by the time they got to Key Stage 5, they backed off that. So that that discussion, or that focus on these skills and the way students write in this way, meant that because they weren't persistently practicing, when they got to university, they had they're out of practice. Maybe they had formed some bad habits. So it's what we can do to support the teaching of, teaching these students these skills.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think there's definitely something that happens when the students move to sort of from 16 to the post-16 education, and their subject focus narrows, because they are all taught that up until that stage, right? And they have quite a sort of tacit and declarative knowledge of things like that. They can talk quite, fronted adverbials and all of the stuff that hits the press. We know that they have those kind of building blocks of language and that awareness of it. And it does sort of peter out a bit, particularly when they go on to A levels, and depending on the choice of A levels they do. And there's so much content to cover in such a small amount of time, and there's all kinds of pressures. So it would be hard to say definitively whether it is or it isn't covered, or whether they are or are not receiving instruction on it. But we work from the assumption, I think, at Brookes, that they don't have instruction on that, and we build in transition support for them. And we do have a transition support syllabus, that focuses on helping students identify where they might have gaps and then address those gaps. So what we're doing is saying we can't know every unknown about what a student is going to arrive at university with or without. But what we have to do is say, these are the things you might need, and see if you can identify what your gaps are. And then here you go, here we'll help you to build that. And we do have a fairly comprehensive program of things that students can do, from our workshop syllabus, our one-to-ones, our embedded sessions, even the writing hub and stuff like that. So we are trying to find ways of working with students, but it all does depend on the students being skilled up enough to identify that the key way that we need to do that is helping the students to identify their own needs, and then signposting them to what's on offer, because there's loads on offer.
Yeah. Well, that's great. So I'm glad that we were able to discuss these key points in a concise way, because the discussion, as I said, lasted quite a long time. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on these key points. And we're looking forward to having more panel discussions like this in the future.